They breathed where I finally started loving me back. And yet for months, I pretended this place was shrinking around me for the ordinary reasons. Old hinges, soft wood, the folding of a woman's life into fewer rooms, when the truth had the shape of paper and the scent of damp cardboard and was stacked neatly under the stairs, where people put things they plan to remember later and conveniently forget. I keep thinking about Ethan's face when he said it, how boys his age try to sound older by lowering their voices and widening their stance. And yet, he had that glint I recognize from my own mirror on the worst days, the one that says, "If I speak." Plainly, someone will call it drama, and if I stay quiet, someone will call it consent. So let me do this quick, and let me do it right, and let me do it now. I didn't hug him there in the kitchen, because the kitchen has ears, the vents, the baby. Monitor left on the counter for no baby at all. The habit of footsteps that arrive just as you find your voice. And I said what old women say when we want the world to think we're harmless. I said, "All right, sweetheart," with a smile so soft it could be mistaken for sleep. And I stirred the soup like nothing was shifting inside me, like a tide wasn't already turning its big cold back to the moon. People think the first betrayal is the one with the big sound, the slammed door, the shouted name, the public humiliation. But most betrayals arrive inside a favor, inside a policy, inside a tone of voice that says this is standard procedure. Don't make it personal. They arrive in talk about safety and efficiency and what's best for everyone. And if you are a woman of a certain age, they arrive wrapped in cotton so that when you realize you have been erased, your fingers are already sticky with the sweet. My son has perfected that tone, the traffic cop of a household, the way he can hold a sentence like a stop sign. And my daughter-in-law can turn care into a leash with 2 syllables, mother. And I have tolerated it because women like me are trained by our own good intentions, trained by the memory of old arguments we regret having won, trained by the guilt of knowing we sometimes stayed when we should have left, and so we bargain with ourselves. Let them think they are protecting you and you can protect your right to breathe. Let them tie the bow for show, and you untie the knot for real at night, hushing the house as if the floorboards could be persuaded to keep a secret. Ethan's whisper slid into that pact like a thin blade between boards. It didn't cut me, not then, but I felt the seam flex, and the draft of another future lifted a strand of hair at my temple. And I knew 2 things at once, that he was asking me to believe him over his parents, and that I already did. I will tell you where I was when the line landed and planted itself like a stake, because place matters, and women my age are always told our memories are mush, when in fact they are maps. I was standing by the window with the south light coming through the screen so that the dust looked like a galaxy doing laps in my kitchen. And on the sill was the little jar where I keep the screws that fall out of chairs. And next to that, the chipped mug that says, "World's okayest baker." And I had just fished out a sprig of thyme that had escaped the pot, and the television in the front room was running the news with the sound off, little boxes of catastrophe sliding across the screen, and the fridge hummed that long mechanical sigh of a machine that knows your habits better than your relatives do. And I felt old, not in the sad way, but in the way that has its own weight and law, the way a boulder is old, providing shade, outlasting trends, collecting moss and secrets. I am not the kind of old that asks permission to stand up. I am the kind of old that stands up, checks that her knees are still making the truce with gravity they negotiated last winter, and takes the key off the hook by the back door with a motion practiced 1,000 times because this is my house, and if they don't like the word my, they can take it up with the papers filed before my son had his first molar. The basement door has always stuck in humid weather and groaned and dry, and it did both that day, which told me the air was changing. And while I didn't go down right then, I am not brave in the Glamour magazine way. I am brave in the way of soup and bills and lending your last 20 and pretending it was your first. I set the kettle to boil, and I watched the steam lift, and I said in my chest, not aloud, because a woman alone learns to speak to herself in the voice of a good friend, I said, you heard the child, and you know which promises outweigh the others, and you didn't come this far to hand your keys to a narrative that calls you mom when it wants something, and the elderly when it wants control. If you need a biography to trust me, here it is, the short one sprawled out long because I am tired of being summarized. I was a bookkeeper who could balance a ledger with a pencil and a prayer, a wife who learned that love can be a kind of weather that changes while you're still hanging the wash, a mother who kept a house afloat with the 100 tiny economies that men love to ignore, a grandmother who knows the weight of a sleeping 10-pound life against her shoulder, and the way that weight rearranges your spine and your sense of destiny. I paid off this mortgage once with coupons and overtime, and then a second time with the widow's arithmetic of selling what is not nailed down and refusing to apologize for it. I buried a husband and a brother and a dog with better manners than most town councilmen, and when my son said he would take the mail for me to make things simpler, I let him, because grief is a kind of fog that makes the nearest voice sound like a lighthouse, and because the first months after a funeral, you are grateful for any hand that doesn't shake, even if later you learn it was taking as much as it was giving. I say this so you understand that my foolishness isn't naivete. It's love doing its misguided best. And that is the only defense I will offer, because the world will condemn a woman for either trusting too little or too much, especially if she keeps the deed in a folder under the good tablecloth and calls that safety. When Ethan said, check the basement, he gave me a choice I had been postponing. The kind you postpone because you can continue to live without making it, and yet your life gets smaller every week, like a sweater that keeps shrinking in a wash. You don't remember starting. I did not march downstairs that minute like a heroine in a serial, because I know the price of drama. I sat, I finished my tea, I washed the cup until the rim squeaked under my thumb. I wiped the counter twice and moved the sponge to let the granite dry evenly. I put the kettle back on its ring because disorder is loud to me, and then I changed into my shoes with the better tread, and I felt in my pocket for the little flashlight that belonged to my husband once, the one with the rubber button. That needs a firm press, and I told my hips we were going to do 3 careful flights down, one to the landing where the photographs lean against the wall in a lazy family of frames because I never decided if they looked better clustered or in a line, one to the cool step where the smell turns from lemon oil to concrete, and one to the ground where spider webs are less frightening than a phone bill in another person's hand. And before I put my foot on the first step, the phone lit up with my son's name, and that familiar electric tug of duty ran through me, answer and be managed, decline and be punished, and I let it ring out because I wanted the first voice I obeyed that day to be mine, 81, and I still have to practice that. If I confess anything in this introduction, let it be this. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to go down there and find mold and failed good intentions, a few boxes of broken promises that we could laugh over and then discard, because I know what it is to love someone past their better self, and I was prepared to love my way through. a reasonable mess. But I had already learned in the small slippages, the rerouted mail, the missing pharmacy receipts, the way my daughter-in-law's eyebrows entered a room before she did, that my life had been slowly refiled under other people's business. Ethan's warning arrived like a receipt in a pocket you haven't worn since last summer. It told me a story about purchases I don't remember making. Perhaps you are wondering why a boy would choose his grandmother over his parents. And I will tell you a secret that isn't really a secret. Children recognize the truth by the way it makes their bodies relax. When I sit with that child, I do not call him Buddy like he's a pet, and I do not perform astonishment when he is capable, and I do not scare him with my fear. I listen. I hand him a knife appropriate to his age and a carrot to practice on. I make room for his competence, and in that room, he placed his faith like a sparrow placing a twig where it wants the nest to be. He told me to check the basement because he has watched me check the weather, check the burner, check the door, not with panic, but with stewardship. He knew I would see what the adults in his life refused to name. So, yes, I am here in this house with its tired rafters and its brave paint and its loyal appliances. And I am walking toward the door that sticks, and I am remembering the other times I have walked toward a thing I knew would change me. The hospital corridor, when my husband's breath snagged and I realized love could not teach lungs to behave. The courthouse steps, when I signed something that preserved the roof and forfeited the ring. The first day of every job where I learned the language of the place by handing my competence like a folded clean towel to strangers. I have survived the kind of days that don't tell you they are history until long after the dishes are done. And I have survived the petty little meannesses that leave no bruise and all scar, and I have survived being mislabeled, misquoted, mistaken, and misspoken for, and I have learned the breath you take just before the truth is a kind of prayer, even if you don't believe in God anymore. If you need a hook, here it is sharpened. When I turned the knob and felt the door argue, I understood that the person I had been to my family, compliant, useful, grateful on cue, could not come with me, and I left her standing barefoot in the good light of the kitchen, apron straight, hands damp, smiling that small smile we learn in girlhood, and I went down alone, one hand on the rail, which was cool and slightly tacky, with the residue of years of summer hands, and the other carrying a light, and I thought, with the fierce tenderness that motherhood sometimes reserves for ourselves and arrives late. If it is mold, we will scrub, and if it is theft, we will name it, and if it is both, we will not be the ones who pretend it is weather. I am telling you this before I tell you what I found, because the finding was only half the salvation. The other half was remembering in the act of stepping down that the ground floor of my life is mine, that love can share a roof without owning the house, that obedience is not a virtue when it is demanded as tribute, and that a whisper from a trembling boy is sometimes the loudest siren a woman will ever hear. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I expected dust, maybe a forgotten box of clothes, the soft hiss of the old boiler that has been threatening retirement for years. But what greeted me was a kind of stillness that does not belong to houses but to hospitals and courtrooms, that coldly deliberate stillness that says, someone has been careful here, careful in the way that means guilty. The bulb above the washer flickered once and steadied, showing a floor swept too clean, no cobwebs, no smell of mildew, only the faint trace of bleach and something metallic underneath, like coins left too long in a closed palm. I stood for a moment, allowing my eyes to adjust, and I realized that someone had moved the old trunk that used to sit under the staircase, the one with the family photos and the wedding dress folded inside tissue paper. It was shoved into the corner, and in its place were 4 neat boxes of file folders, the kind from an office, stacked with military precision, each labeled in my handwriting, but not by my hand. My name looked like it had been forged by someone imitating politeness. I reached for the nearest box, and the label read, Utilities and Taxes, Martha H. I knew immediately it wasn't mine. My handwriting leans left, almost apologetic, as if each word is curtsying to the next. This was upright, authoritative, the way my son writes checks. Fast, confident, without doubt that the world will honor them. I lifted the lid and found envelopes sliced open at the top, their contents neatly folded but never answered. County tax notices, mortgage statements, and letters stamped in red, urgent, final notice, property at risk. The newest one was dated 2 weeks ago. My name appeared at the top of every page, but the return addresses were all routed to a post office box number I didn't recognize. My stomach went cold and then warm, like standing too close to a fire you didn't start. There was another folder inside marked Reinvestment Plan, and inside that, a notarized paper with my signature photocopied, and a second page showing my son's neat blue ink, his real signature, his real hand, his quiet betrayal. I remember sitting on the wooden step, not quite on the floor, not quite standing, in that halfway posture of realization. The air down there had weight. I could hear the thrum of the house above, the faint creak of footsteps, the muffled sound of my daughter-in-law's voice somewhere on the phone, her sharp laugh slicing through the boards. I felt like I was listening to another world through a wall of glass. The numbers on the pages danced, a mortgage amount I never agreed to, withdrawals from accounts I thought closed, insurance premiums that bore my initials in places I never put them. It was as if someone had hollowed me out on paper, kept the shell of my name, and filled it with their emergencies. I pressed my fingers against the table where the papers were spread and felt the pulse in my wrist like an alarm clock that would not stop ringing. There is a special kind of quiet that falls when an old woman realizes her patience has been weaponized against her. I do not remember standing up, but I must have, because I found myself by the trunk, opening it with the same key I have carried since my wedding day. The smell of cedar rose up like a ghost of safety. Inside, beneath the lace tablecloths and the photo albums, I found another envelope, thin, unopened, addressed to me from the County Property Division. It had been torn slightly at the corner, as if someone had checked its contents and decided it could wait. The date on the stamp matched the week my son insisted on helping me organize the mail. My fingers shook as I peeled it open. Inside, a formal notice of lien placement for non-payment of taxes, 30 days to contest, 60 to vacate. The letterhead shimmered faintly in the basement light. It didn't even look real, like a prop from a drama about someone else's bad luck. I reread it twice and then folded it slowly, smoothing each crease with the side of my thumb. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe this was some administrative error, a miscommunication, the harmless tangle of bureaucracy. But denial, like perfume, fades faster on old skin. I thought of the conversations we had at dinner, the sudden insistence that I sign a few routine documents, the way my son said, "Don't worry, Mom, it's just to consolidate the accounts." I had trusted him, not because he was trustworthy, but because I was tired of arguing, tired of proving I understood the fine print, tired of watching the flicker of irritation cross his face when I asked questions. He had taken that fatigue and built himself a bridge to convenience, one forged out of my exhaustion. When I turned to leave the basement, I caught my reflection in the small square mirror nailed above the workbench. It's been there since Derek, my husband, used it to shave before going to the night shift at the plant. The mirror was cloudy, scratched with time, but in it I saw my face steady and strange, as though my features had rearranged themselves into something less yielding. I didn't look shocked. I looked awake. There's a difference, and that difference is the beginning of every rebellion that matters. I climbed the stairs slowly, the papers still in my hand, the wooden steps creaking in their old familiar protest. At the top, I paused, listening to the murmur of voices upstairs, my daughter-in-law scolding one of the children, my son pacing on the phone, saying words like refinance and liquidate. It struck me then that these were not the sounds of family. They were the sounds of business, of calculation, of people who had long since replaced affection with strategy. I stood in the shadow of the doorframe and felt the shape of the choice forming in me. Either confront them now and watch them lie, or wait and watch them reveal themselves by their own impatience. I chose the second, because truth, when cornered, always claws its way out on its own. That night, I placed the papers in the drawer of my nightstand, under the photo of my husband. I lay awake listening to the soft, mechanical pulse of the baby monitor that they had left in the hallway, though the baby slept soundly upstairs. It picked up every whisper, every small betrayal of tone. Around midnight, I heard my son's voice, low and sharp. "She doesn't need to know. It's almost done." And my daughter-in-law's reply, colder than bleach water, "As long as the paperwork clears, she'll still have a roof." That's what matters. The distance between their room and mine was only 20 feet, but it felt like continents. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the plaster cracks that looked like rivers on an old map, and realized that what I had mistaken for family was now a settlement, an occupied territory with new laws and no language for mercy. By morning, my decision had settled quietly, the way dust does after a storm. I made coffee, buttered toast, set the table as if nothing in the world had shifted. When my son came down in his pressed shirt and cheerful voice, asking if I'd slept well, I said yes, and handed him his mug with both hands so he wouldn't see the slight tremor. He talked about errands, about property values, about how the market's crazy right now, and I listened like a woman taking notes for a story she would one day tell. I asked nothing. I only said I might go through some old boxes in the basement later, see what could be donated. He smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that belongs to people hiding knives in their words. "Oh, don't worry about that, Mom. I'll handle it this weekend." I smiled back, folded my napkin neatly, and said, "Of course, dear. I just like to keep things tidy." When he left for work, the house exhaled. I went to the window and watched his car disappear around the corner, that gleaming silver SUV he always polishes on Sundays while preaching about financial prudence. I thought of all the Sundays I had spent polishing floors, believing in cleanliness as a form of love. I realized love can also be the dirtiest business of all when it becomes an investment expected to yield returns. I went back to the basement and opened each box, photographing every document, every envelope, sending copies to a new email account I created under a name no one would guess. The printer paper smelled faintly of toner and inevitability. Somewhere above, the house creaked like a body shifting in its sleep. There is a moment in every story when discovery turns into evidence, and evidence turns into danger. I reached it when I found the file labeled insurance. Inside was a beneficiary form, with my name crossed out and replaced with his. The date on the amendment was the same week he had driven me to the doctor for my blood pressure check, The day he held my elbow in the parking lot, like a gentleman escorting a relic. I laughed then, quietly, the sound dry as old paper. There was no malice left in me, only clarity, the kind that slices instead of burns. I went upstairs, opened the kitchen window to let in the late morning air, and brewed another pot of coffee, this time stronger. The smell of roasted beans filled the room, grounding me in something solid, something mine. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. Fury without proof is just noise, and I had made enough noise in my life that went unheard. I would collect, observe, prepare. I would move carefully, as women like me have always moved when the ground beneath us starts to crack. When Ethan came home from school that afternoon, he dropped his backpack by the door and looked at me, searching my face for something. I nodded once, a silent promise. He didn't ask and I didn't tell, because both of us knew that some truths need to ripen before they can be spoken. He sat at the table doing homework while I cooked dinner, and the sound of his pencil scratching on paper was the most honest sound in that house. Underneath it all, the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint whir of the ceiling fan wove themselves into a rhythm that reminded me of heartbeat and time passing and survival. I looked at him, at the small crease between his eyebrows, at the same stubborn dimple his father once had when he was good, and I whispered in my mind a vow as binding as any legal document. This child will not inherit our silence. By the time the sun set, I had packed a folder of the most damning papers, sealed them in a plastic sleeve, and slid them under the lining of my suitcase. The suitcase I had not used since Derek's funeral, the one my son told me to put away for now. I zipped it shut and placed it upright in the closet like a sentry. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and let the weight of the day settle into my bones, not as sorrow but as instruction. The basement had given me its answer. What I had found down there wasn't just proof of betrayal. It was a map, a warning, a second chance at owning the story of my own name. And as I turned off the lamp, I realized I was no longer afraid of the dark below. The real darkness was upstairs, tidy and well-spoken, wearing my son's voice like a borrowed suit, and it did not know that I had already begun to turn on the light. For the next several weeks, life in the house carried on with the same steady rhythm, though every note now rang false, as if the tune we had always played together had slipped a half step out of key. Morning coffee tasted metallic. The clink of the spoon against the mug sounded sharper than it used to, and even the small courtesies, my son asking if I wanted anything from the store, my daughter-in-law placing a folded napkin by my plate, had the precision of a stage performance. Nothing had changed outwardly. The furniture still sat in its curated angles. The light still came through the window at that same forgiving hour of late afternoon, and yet the air between us was different. I began to see what I had never dared admit, that I had been slowly evicted from my own life long before the threat of papers and debts ever arrived. The house was still mine indeed, but no longer an atmosphere. My voice had become background noise, my habits reclassified as quaint inconveniences, my presence tolerated only because it was still useful. I tried to keep to my routines, though they now felt like camouflage rather than comfort. I baked bread. I clipped coupons. I wiped down the counters until they gleamed, because a woman with purpose is harder to move out of the way. I listened carefully when they spoke about timelines and transfers in low tones by the window. My son's voice always softened when he lied. He thought gentleness could pass for decency. "It's all temporary, Mom," he would say, smiling that smile that was too smooth to trust. "You'll be taken care of." The phrase made my skin prickle. I had spent a lifetime taking care of others. The idea of being taken care of was not kindness, but burial under a silk sheet. I watched them whisper after dinner, her hands slicing through the air, his jaw set, the performance of concern, and I felt something in me cool to a steady clarity. Sometimes Ethan would catch my eye across the table, and I could see the weight in his expression, that awkward guilt children carry when they know too much. He began spending more time in my room, pretending to play on his phone, but I knew he was listening. Once, he slipped me a folded piece of paper torn from his school notebook. On it, he had written 2 words, bank receipts, underneath an arrow pointing down. I nodded, slid it into my sweater pocket, and didn't speak. That night, when the house went quiet, I waited until the hum of the dishwasher covered my footsteps, and I went to the small desk in the hallway where my son kept the family finances locked. The key was still in the top drawer under a stack of bills. I turned it carefully, opened the file, and there they were. Receipts for wire transfers, statements with balances that had dwindled from thousands to almost nothing. The transactions all led to one new account under his name, opened 3 months earlier. I stood there in the dim light, reading line after line, the numbers swimming like minnows, the proof of my slow erasure set down in tidy rows. When I closed the drawer, I felt not fear, but a strange, pulsing calm. People imagine discovery as a burst of energy, but often it is the opposite. It is stillness so deep you can hear the truth adjusting its weight. The next morning, my daughter-in-law suggested I try resting more. She said it with the kind of smile reserved for toddlers and the infirm. "You've been looking tired lately," she told me while slicing fruit that nobody would eat. "Maybe let us handle things for a while." I thanked her and carried my coffee out to the porch, where the sun was thin and patient. There, I allowed myself a private rebellion. I called the county office under the pretext of confirming a tax payment. The clerk, a woman named Carla with a tired voice and a precise politeness, looked up my records and hesitated. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "I show an appeal filed last month contesting ownership transfer. Is that your signature?" She described the document, and I almost laughed. My son had forged another act of protection. "No," I said, "that's an error. I'll be in soon to correct it." My hands trembled when I hung up, not with panic, but with fury so well-tempered it felt medicinal. That evening, when my son came home, he was all ease and anecdotes, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. He told a story about his work, some success he had supposedly achieved, and I smiled at the right moments. But when he caught my gaze, just for a fraction of a second, he looked away too quickly. He must have sensed something in me had shifted. Guilt, like smoke, always betrays its source. I thought of Derek, my late husband, who once told me that lies leave fingerprints on the air if you're quiet enough to feel them. The air in that room was thick with fingerprints. I began keeping a notebook hidden in the lining of my sewing box, recording dates, phone calls, and phrases, building a private archive of what they hoped would vanish into confusion. It was not spite that drove me. It was the need to prove, if only to myself, that my memory was still a weapon. Each entry steadied me. Every notation was an act of reclamation. I learned to play my part during the day, the obedient matriarch with her tidy habits and gentle forgetfulness. But at night, I became something else entirely, the witness they did not expect. I reread those notes before bed like prayers to a God of reason. My son began talking about selling the second car to simplify expenses. My daughter-in-law began dropping hints about new opportunities in another state. The pattern was obvious. They were preparing for departure. I noticed that their laughter came easier when they spoke of plans that did not include me. One evening, I overheard her telling a friend on the phone, "Once it's all finalized, we'll start fresh. She'll be comfortable wherever she ends up." The phrase, "wherever she ends up," hung in the air like a draft from an open window. I realized they were already imagining me as elsewhere, an absence they could afford to pity from a distance. The following weekend, I found the courage to act more openly. I walked into the kitchen while they were discussing paperwork and said, "If you're handling property matters, I'd like to review the documents myself." My son froze, the color rising in his neck. "It's complicated, Mom," he said, a little too quickly. "Let me simplify it for you later." I smiled and replied, "I've been simplifying things for men my whole life. It's my specialty." Then I walked out before he could answer. The silence that followed me down the hallway was as loud as thunder. That night, Ethan came to my room again. He sat on the edge of the bed, nervous but determined, his knees bouncing. "Grandma," he said, "Dad's been making calls about moving. He said something about listing the house soon. He doesn't think you'll fight him." His eyes glistened with confusion, loyalty torn in two directions. I reached for his hand, his fingers still ink-stained from drawing, and said softly, "Then he's forgotten who taught him to fight for what's his." I didn't mean violence. I meant endurance, the kind that folds laundry and pain in the same basket and still finds order. I told him not to worry, that grown-ups sometimes build cages and call them plans, but that I was already holding the key. The next morning, I went into town under the guise of grocery shopping. Instead, I walked into the legal aid office, the one 2 blocks from the library. The young attorney listened as I explained, showing her copies of the documents I had photographed. She looked at them for a long moment and said, "Mrs. Hart." On the way home, I stopped by a small cafe I hadn't visited in years, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window watching people pass. For the first time in months, I felt something like ownership return, not just of the house, but of my own narrative. The street outside looked ordinary, but to me it shimmered with possibility. Back home, I slipped into my usual quiet, aware that the smallest misstep could alert them. My daughter-in-law began treating me with exaggerated sweetness, the kind that smells faintly of fear. She offered to do my laundry, to bring me tea, to schedule my doctor appointments. My son avoided eye contact, burying himself in work, though I noticed him checking his phone compulsively, perhaps waiting for messages from banks or brokers. I moved like a ghost through my own home, hearing everything, touching nothing. The cruelty of it was that they believed they were winning. At night, the house made its usual noises, the pipes moaning, the boards expanding, and I would lie awake listening, wondering how many women before me had slept in rooms they paid for but no longer owned. I thought of my mother, who used to say that silence can rot you faster than grief, and I wondered how long I had been decaying politely. Sometimes I go to the window and look at the faint reflection of the living room where my son sat watching television, the blue light flickering on his face, making him look both young and guilty. I wanted to love him still, and I did, but love had become a thing I carried like a stone, heavy, necessary, not meant to be dropped. Ethan kept my secret as if it were his own. He would leave little signs, a book left open to a marked page, a whisper before bedtime, a knowing glance when conversation turned sharp. He was learning that truth is sometimes the most dangerous possession, and I hated that he had to learn it so young. Yet, in that shared secrecy, something luminous grew between us, a quiet alliance of the outnumbered. I told him once, as he handed me a letter I had asked him to fetch from the mailbox, "Courage isn't noise, darling. It's keeping your hand steady while everyone else is shaking." He nodded solemnly, as though committing it to memory. Days passed. each one tightening the coil of deception until even the air seemed ready to snap. I waited for the right moment, gathering evidence, steadying my resolve. The first escalation, I realized, was not confrontation, but the subtle art of endurance, the refusal to surrender while pretending to yield. And so I lived those days as if they were rehearsals for freedom, cooking meals I no longer tasted, smiling at lies I'd already unmasked, nodding through conversations that only confirmed what I already knew. Beneath every polite gesture, rebellion simmered quietly, invisible but alive, and I could feel it growing with every breath. The war had already begun, but they didn't know the enemy was sitting at their own table, sipping tea from her favorite cup, waiting for the next move. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that pretends to be harmless, bright enough to make you believe in peace again. The morning had been calm, the newspaper folded neatly by the coffee pot, my son humming under his breath as he left for work, my daughter-in-law chatting about school pickups and groceries as if our household were not built entirely on deceit. I had begun to feel the strain of my double life, the long hours spent acting docile while my mind worked like a machine behind my calm face. Each day, I told myself to wait just one more day, to gather one more piece of proof, to breathe through one more dinner of false politeness. The waiting had become its own kind of fever. That afternoon, I decided to break it. I took the bus into town under the excuse of visiting the pharmacy. The seat smelled faintly of dust and winter coats, and the movement of the road soothed me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in months, I was traveling without permission. The freedom was almost physical. I could feel it settling in my shoulders, uncoiling something that had been tight for too long. I carried with me the small envelope that held copies of the documents I had photographed. Folded so many times the creases had become white scars on the paper. At the county clerk's office, I met Nora, an old friend from church who now worked behind one of the desks. We hadn't spoken in years, but when she looked up and saw me standing there, something like recognition flickered behind her eyes, followed by concern. "Martha, you all right?" she asked. I handed her the envelope without a word. She opened it, scanned the papers quickly, and then looked at me again, with a seriousness I hadn't seen since the funerals we used to attend together. "You did right to come," she said softly. "This is bad." While she made copies and checked the records, I sat in the hard plastic chair by the wall, staring at the dusty blinds. I thought of all the times I had come here before, renewing licenses, filing forms, the small administrative errands of life, and how invisible I must have seemed, a quiet woman with tidy handwriting and no history of complaint. I had always believed that good behavior built a shield against harm. Now I saw that goodness only ever protects those who expect punishment. It offers no defense against those who plan it. Nora returned with a stack of printouts, her face set. "Your name's still on the deed," she said, "but there was an attempt to transfer ownership through a secondary loan. Whoever filed it did so with forged consent. If you act now, you can stop it. I'll flag it as disputed until you can get legal verification." Her words were a lifeline thrown into deep water. I felt my throat close with gratitude. We went through the documents together, line by line, and I could see her shock deepen. "He used your personal identification number," she murmured. "And this signature, this isn't even close to yours." She looked up, and for a moment, her professionalism faltered. "It's your son, isn't it?" I nodded once. She sighed, then reached across the counter to squeeze my hand. "You don't have to handle this alone." I wanted to tell her that loneliness had long since stopped being a condition. It had become a skill. Instead, I thanked her and promised to return with any additional papers she might need. When I stepped out into the sunlight, the city looked sharper, edges defined, colors no longer washed out by fear. I realized that I had already crossed a boundary. I was no longer simply surviving. I was acting. On the way home, I stopped at a payphone near the old library and called the legal aid office again. The young attorney who had helped me before answered. I told her what Nora had discovered, and she said she could expedite the injunction if I brought the official records. We can protect your ownership through a temporary hold, she explained, but you mustn't alert them until it's filed. I promised I wouldn't. When I hung up, my reflection in the glass booth startled me. The woman staring back looked neither frightened nor weak. Her face, lined and pale, carried a new steadiness. I thought, almost with amusement, that my son wouldn't recognize this expression. He had never seen me armed with knowledge instead of affection. That evening, I cooked dinner as usual, chicken stew, biscuits, the comfort food of ordinary life, and the scent filled the kitchen with a nostalgia that almost undid me. Ethan sat at the table doing his homework. I caught him watching me as I ladled soup into bowls. You look different, he said quietly. Lighter. I smiled at him and replied, maybe because I finally stopped believing in things that don't believe in me. He didn't fully understand, but he smiled back, and the smallness of that moment anchored me more than any legal document could. He represented the piece of the future that was still unbroken. After dinner, I carried a tray with tea into the living room where my son and his wife sat watching television. I told them I had gone into town for some errands and that I had run into Nora. My son's eyes flickered just for a second, a nervous spark that he quickly hid behind a grin. Oh, Nora from church? He asked, too casually. Did she say anything interesting? I shook my head and told him she asked about the garden. It was almost comical, the way his shoulders relaxed, how easily he believed I would never step beyond my designated script. He had built his confidence on the assumption that I would remain predictable. That illusion was already cracking. When they went to bed, I sat in the quiet living room with the lights off, the glow of the street lamp painting stripes across the rug. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, I felt something close to power. It wasn't revenge or anger, though both were present in small doses. It was a deeper, older strength, the kind that comes from finally seeing the landscape of your own life clearly. I understood that all the years of caretaking, of smoothing other people's tempers, of making peace in rooms where I wasn't heard, those had been rehearsals for this moment. People think endurance is passive, but it is not. It is the slow build of steel under the surface of skin. The next morning, I took my coffee outside, breathing the cold air, listening to the faint hum of cars on the distant road. The world, in its ordinariness, felt almost sacred. I thought of Derek again, of how he used to say that there are two kinds of courage, the kind that rushes forward and the kind that stands very still. I realized I had been standing still for too long, mistaking it for virtue. Now, the time for stillness was over. I had moved quietly, yes, but not invisibly. My steps had left prints, and those prints were leading towards something irreversible. The days that followed moved in strange suspension. My son grew more restless, my daughter-in-law more attentive, their nervous energy betraying the sense that control was slipping from their hands. I answered their politeness with serene calm, as though nothing at all had shifted. I began to prepare the paperwork for the injunction, filling out forms in the middle of the night, with my glasses perched on the tip of my nose, the house silent except for the occasional sigh of the radiator. There was a strange comfort in the sound of my pen scratching across the page. It reminded me that I was still capable of authorship, even if the text was bureaucratic. The midpoint of any story is the hinge, the turning of the tide. For me, that hinge came late one evening when Nora called. "The hold is confirmed," she said. "They can't legally touch the property now. You're protected." Her voice was soft but firm, the sound of structure returning to chaos. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still in the dark, my hand resting on the table where the phone had been. I realized that, legally, I was safe, but emotionally, I was about to step into a battlefield where truth alone would not be enough. My son would discover soon that his plan had failed, and then the real test would begin. Yet even that knowledge did not frighten me. There is a strange serenity that comes when fear finally exhausts itself and transforms into resolve. Later that night, I went to check on Ethan. He was asleep, one arm flung across his pillow, his face soft and unguarded. I sat beside him for a while, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We're all right now," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "You did something brave, and so did I." The lamp beside his bed cast a faint golden halo around him, and I thought of all the children born into houses where adults mistake ownership for love. I promised myself that he would not grow up believing kindness was a weakness. Before I went to bed, I opened the window slightly, letting in the night air. It carried the smell of rain and earth, the scent of things beginning again. I stood there, feeling the coolness against my skin, and for the first time in years, I let myself imagine a life that belonged entirely to me. Not as someone's mother or grandmother or dependent, but as a woman who had outlived deceit. The shift had already happened inside me, quiet and unstoppable, like a tide changing direction under the surface before anyone notices. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, yes, but tonight was mine, and I intended to keep it. It began with the sound of a drawer slamming somewhere upstairs, that sudden wooden crack that travels through the bones of a house like a warning shot. I was in the kitchen kneading dough, the soft rhythm of my palms against the flour, the only steady thing in the room, when the footsteps came down the hall. My son's, heavy, quick, purposeful. He entered without knocking, without the small preamble of politeness he usually wore like a mask. His face was pale and drawn tight around the mouth, his tie still hanging loose around his neck, eyes wide in a panic that made him look younger and more dangerous at once. "What did you do?" he demanded before I could speak, and I knew at once that he had discovered the injunction. His voice cracked on the word "do," like it was breaking under the weight of its own entitlement. I wiped my hands slowly on a towel, not rushing, because I had learned that haste is the language of guilt, and I was not the guilty one. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, and I meant it to sound calm, but my own voice startled me. It was deeper, steadier, as though I were channeling someone who had been waiting her whole life to speak through me. He threw a pile of papers on the counter. They fanned out like angry birds. "These," he said, pointing. "The county sent notice that the deed transfer's frozen, that the property is under investigation. Do you have any idea what kind of mess this causes?" I looked at the papers as though they were a set of foreign hieroglyphs. The pages bore the seal of the county and my name in bold type. My name exactly as it should have been all along. "It's strange," I said quietly. "The kind of mess that happens when someone tries to take what doesn't belong to them." He flinched, then recovered, trying to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. "Mom, come on. This is just bureaucracy getting confused. You don't understand how these things work. You must have talked to someone who twisted it around." His words spilled fast, desperate to fill the silence. I realized that all his life he had relied on the momentum of his own talking. He believed language could smother truth if he poured it out fast enough. I didn't interrupt him. I let him exhaust himself, watching how his hands moved, the same hands I had once guided around a spoon or tied into mittens before school, now clutching papers as if they were weapons. When he finally stopped to breathe, I said simply, "You forged my signature." He froze. There was no denial, just the stunned stillness of someone who hadn't yet rehearsed this version of the scene. I saw the documents, the withdrawals, the property lien. I continued. You used my name and my trust to feed whatever hole you've been digging for yourself. I can't imagine what you told your wife or your bank or your conscience, but you will not tell me that this is confusion. My words were measured, each one like a bead clicking onto a string. He tried to speak, but nothing came out except a whisper that might have been my name. Then came the shouting. He moved closer, the heat of him filling the room. You're ruining everything, he said. You don't get how close we are to losing it all. I did this for you, for this family. I had to bite back the bitter laugh that rose in my throat. You don't do theft for someone, I said. You do it to them. The argument spiraled, each sentence a blade. He called me ungrateful, accused me of choosing strangers over blood, of letting outsiders poison me with suspicion. He said things I won't repeat because they were designed to wound, not communicate. Through it all, I stayed still, my back to the counter, my hands resting flat on the cool tile to steady myself. The dough lay forgotten on the table, drying at the edges, the yeast dying quietly as our conversation turned to rot. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway, small and pale, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He had come home from school early, unseen by either of us. He looked from his father to me, confusion and dread mixing on his face. "Dad," he said softly. The sound cut through the room like glass. My son turned toward him, his fury flickering into something like shame. "Go to your room, Ethan," he said, his voice lower now, controlled. "This is between adults." But the boy didn't move. He stood there, fists clenched, and said quietly, "You said Grandma was okay with everything. You lied." That single sentence, small and trembling, broke something open that could never be closed again. My son's jaw tightened. "Don't talk to me that way," he snapped, but there was no power left in it. He stormed out of the kitchen, papers still scattered, leaving behind the echo of a man who had finally met a truth he couldn't intimidate. After he left, the house fell into a long silence. The ticking of the clock sounded like footsteps receding down a hallway of memory. I turned to Ethan, whose eyes were wide with the kind of understanding no child should have. "It's all right," I told him, though I wasn't sure it was. He stepped forward and hugged me, his small body trembling against mine. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I stroked his hair and said, "You have nothing to be sorry for." We stood like that for a long time, until the light from the window turned the kitchen gold and thin, the hour of truth's quiet aftermath. That night, my daughter-in-law came into my room without knocking. She was pale but composed, carrying the brittle poise of someone rehearsing a performance. "I don't know what you told the county," she began, "but this whole situation is spinning out of control. You're putting us all in jeopardy." Her voice trembled at the edges, though she tried to disguise it as indignation. I looked at her, the neat hair, the manicured hands gripping the doorframe, and I saw not a villain, but a woman afraid of losing her version of comfort. "You could have stopped this," she said, her eyes flashing. "You could have trusted us." I thought of all the times I had trusted silence and where it had led. "I trusted you long enough," I replied, "long enough for you to mistake it for permission." For a moment she seemed ready to lash out, but instead she turned abruptly and left, the perfume of her anger lingering in the air like smoke. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt my heartbeat in my fingertips. I knew what would come next, the last desperate push, the confrontation that would try to reclaim what I had already taken back. The next few days passed in tense quiet. My son barely spoke to me. I could hear him pacing late at night, making phone calls, muttering about lawyers. I imagined him spinning new stories, trying to build escape routes from the trap he had set himself. Meanwhile, I continued my small rebellions. I visited the bank to secure my accounts, moved my savings into a separate fund under legal supervision, and had Nora witness the notarization of the new protective order. Every action felt like reclaiming an inch of ground that had been stolen under my feet. Then, one evening, just as the last of the daylight thinned into shadow, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw two men in suits, one carrying a clipboard, the other holding a folder stamped with the county seal. My stomach clenched. My son appeared behind me suddenly, breathless, his shirt untucked, eyes darting. "Don't open it," he hissed. But it was too late. I already had. The men were polite, almost apologetic. They handed me an official notice. The bank was initiating proceedings against the fraudulent loan, naming him as the responsible party and me as the primary claimant. His face drained of color as he realized the full weight of what was about to fall on him. The men asked for a signature to confirm receipt. I signed with steady hand, the way one signs a contract with herself. After they left, he turned to me with a look I can only describe as lost. "They'll come after me," he said quietly. "They'll ruin everything." There was no more anger in his voice, only disbelief that the universe had stopped revolving around his justifications. "You did this," he said, almost whispering. "You chose strangers over your own son." I looked at him for a long time. "I chose truth," I said. "If that makes me a stranger to you, then I've been one for a long time." He turned away, his shoulders slumping, and left the room. I heard the door to his study slam. A moment later, the sound of glass breaking. I didn't follow. There are moments when silence is not surrender but boundary, and I had finally learned the difference. The next day, Ethan came downstairs, pale and nervous. "Dad's packing," he said. "Mom's helping him. They said we might move in with her parents for a while." I nodded, though my throat was tight. "Let them," I said softly. "Some lessons require distance." I went about my morning as if everything were normal, but inside me there was a strange mix of grief and relief. I didn't want them destroyed. I only wanted them to stop believing they could destroy me. Around noon, my son came to me one last time. He stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, the weight of his choices pressing against the air between us. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. And for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who brought me dandelions and called them flowers. "Intentions don't erase damage," I said, my voice almost kind. "But they do teach us what kind of people we really are." He nodded once, eyes shining with tears he wouldn't let fall, then turned and walked out. The sound of the car engine starting was the cleanest silence I'd ever heard. When the house finally emptied, I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by sunlight and absence. The air felt new. I looked at the papers stacked neatly before me, the deed, the injunction, the correspondence, and realized that every piece of evidence was also a fragment of my freedom. Ethan came to sit beside me. "It's over?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, darling, it's begun." Because the truth was that what had ended was not just their scheme, but my complicity in my own silencing. I felt something unfamiliar rise in me, not triumph exactly, but a steadiness that tasted like peace after hunger. I reached for his hand. "We'll be all right," I said. "The hardest part is done." That night, I walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, touching the walls as if to remind them I was still here. In the hallway mirror, I saw my reflection and thought of how many women disappear into caretaking, how many lose their names under the signatures of others. The woman in the mirror did not look erased. She looked restored. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage of pretense and the clean ground of truth. I went to the basement door and opened it wide, letting the faint smell of earth rise up. The boxes were still there, but they no longer frightened me. They were just objects now, emptied of their deceit. The house exhaled. So did I. In the following days, there were calls from lawyers and clerks, confirmations and apologies, the machinery of justice grinding slowly but effectively. I handled them with composure. Nora came by once, bringing a pie and a long, tight hug. "You did the right thing," she said. I told her that right things never feel right while you're doing them, only later, when the noise fades. Ethan spent more time with me than ever, reading on the couch, helping in the garden. Sometimes, when the sun slanted through the window just right, I caught him watching me with quiet awe, as if he had discovered that courage could come in the shape of an old woman with flour on her hands. I never told him how afraid I had been, because fear deserves its own dignity when it has done its job. One evening, as the day dimmed into that soft hour between light and dark, he asked, "Grandma, are you mad at Dad?" I thought about it, really thought. "No," I said finally. "I'm sad for him. He mistook control for safety. That's a terrible way to live." He nodded, absorbing it like scripture. We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't hurt. Later, when I climbed the stairs to bed, I realized that the house no longer carried the echo of their footsteps. It was quiet, yes, but not empty. The quiet had shape, purpose. I paused by the window and looked out at the street, the lamplight pooling on the pavement, the slow flutter of a moth against the glass. I thought about survival, how it rarely looks heroic. It looks like paperwork and patience, like standing your ground while pretending to be invisible until the moment you step fully into the light. It looks like a grandmother keeping her promise to a boy who believed her when no one else did. And though I did not know what tomorrow would bring, apologies, reconciliation, or more silence, I knew that whatever it was, I would meet it standing upright, with my name unborrowed and my house still my own. The morning the officer came, the air was unusually still, that kind of charged quiet before a storm, when every sound seemed suspended, waiting for permission to move again. I was in the kitchen, folding dish towels into perfect squares, when I heard the car doors outside and the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Ethan was sitting at the table doing homework, pencil tapping against the page in a slow rhythm. I glanced at him, and he looked up, his eyes searching mine for something, maybe fear, maybe reassurance. "It's all right," I said, though my own hands had started to tremble. Through the window, I saw two figures approaching the porch, one in a dark suit, holding a clipboard, and another in a county uniform. It was a scene I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks, but now that it was here, the reality of it hit with a weight I hadn't expected. The men knocked politely, almost tenderly, as if they knew that politeness is the last mercy bureaucracy can offer. I opened the door before they could knock a second time. "Mrs. Harlow?" the officer asked. I nodded. He introduced himself and handed me a sheaf of documents in a brown envelope, the county seal pressed into the corner like a bruise. "This is confirmation of ownership reinstatement," he said. "You're the sole title holder. We just need your acknowledgement." He paused, then added quietly, "We also have a summons for your son. He'll be notified through separate channels." His tone was professional, but there was pity in his eyes, the kind men use when they see an old woman where they expected a victim. I thanked him, signed where he indicated, and invited them in for coffee out of habit. They declined, muttering something about other appointments, and left their footprints in the thin dust on the porch. I stood there for a long moment holding the papers, feeling the pulse of my heart in my palms. From behind me, I heard the creak of a floorboard. My son stood at the end of the hallway, hair uncombed, shirt half-buttoned, the color drained from his face. He must have seen the cars arrive, must have known before I did what this visit meant. "What did you do?" he asked, but the question came out softer this time, the sharpness gone. I turned toward him slowly. "I told the truth," I said, "and the truth did the rest." He stepped forward, his voice rising again. "You went to the county, to lawyers. Do you know what you've done? They'll destroy me, Mom. You've handed them everything." I met his eyes and said, "No, you handed them everything the day you forged my name." There was a long pause between us, filled with years of dinners, holidays, birthdays, the small domestic kindnesses that now felt counterfeit under the weight of this revelation. I saw in him flashes of the boy he had been, the one who scraped his knees and cried into my apron, the one who used to promise he'd build me a house one day, so I'd never have to work again. That boy had died quietly somewhere between ambition and fear, and I was mourning him even as I faced the man before me. Ethan came to the doorway, watching us. My son turned toward him and said, "Go upstairs. This doesn't concern you." But Ethan didn't move. He stood his ground, his voice trembling but clear. "It does concern me. You lied to both of us." The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. My son's shoulders sagged. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I was trying to save us, to fix things before they got worse." I looked at him and said, "Nothing you fix with lies stays fixed." For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy with unspoken things, apologies that would never come, forgiveness that would never be earned. Then the phone rang, that old kitchen phone with its shrill, unrelenting tone. It startled all of us. My son answered, and as he listened, his expression crumpled. "Yes," he said finally, "I understand." He hung up, and for a long while he stared at the wall as if reading something written there. "They froze my accounts," he said quietly. "Everything's gone." His voice wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. I watched him set the phone down, his hands shaking. "I'll have to leave town for a while," he said almost to himself. "They'll want statements, records, depositions. I can't stay here." I nodded because there was nothing to say. The punishment he feared was already inside him, the knowledge that he had been caught by the one person he thought too weak to fight back. My daughter-in-law came home soon after, her heels clicking across the floor like punctuation marks in a sentence none of us could finish. She saw the envelope on the table, the papers spread neatly beside it, and she understood instantly. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice brittle. He nodded once. She exhaled sharply, then turned to me with a look that was part anger, part disbelief. "You've destroyed this family," she said. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I met her gaze and said, "No, I saved what little was left of it." She shook her head, muttering something about lawyers and disgrace, and disappeared into the bedroom. My son followed her. Through the thin walls, I could hear fragments of their conversation, accusations, weeping, the sound of suitcases being dragged out from under the bed. Ethan sat beside me, silent, his small hand resting on my arm like an anchor. By evening, they were gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just the dull finality of the car doors closing and the engine fading down the street. I stood at the window and watched the taillights vanish into the dark. For a long time, I felt nothing. Relief didn't come immediately. It arrived slowly, like light filtering through dirty glass. I realized that I had spent years waiting for someone else's permission to feel safe in my own home. Now, finally, the silence was mine. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, as if to reassure it that the storm had passed. The living room smelled faintly of cologne and dust, the ghost of domesticity lingering in the air. I opened the windows one by one, letting the night breeze carry it all away. Later, I went to the basement. The same basement that had once held secrets now held only truth. The boxes were still there, though I had long since emptied them of their poison. I had repacked them with photographs, letters, small mementos of the life that had nearly been erased. I turned on the light, that single bulb swinging gently from its cord, and for the first time the glow felt warm rather than interrogative. I sat on the bottom step, listening to the hum of the house, the pipes, the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock upstairs, and I realized that this was my sanctuary now, not my prison. Every betrayal, every quiet cruelty had led me here, to this exact moment of reclamation. Ethan joined me, his socks silent on the wooden stairs. "It feels different down here," he said, "like it's breathing again." I smiled. "That's what truth does," I told him. "It gives air back to what's been suffocating." He sat beside me, and we stayed there for a while, not speaking. Above us, the house creaked softly, settling into its new peace. I felt his head rest against my shoulder, and a wave of tenderness swept through me, sharper than any grief. I had thought that losing my son in this way would feel like death, but instead, it felt like birth. Painful, raw, necessary. When I finally went back upstairs, the night had deepened into a kind of stillness that only follows great upheaval. I made us tea, and we sat by the window watching the rain begin to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof like applause. "Are you sad?" Ethan asked. I considered the question carefully. "A little," I said, "but sadness isn't the same as regret." He frowned slightly, trying to understand. Sometimes we do hard things, not because we want to, but because we can't live inside the lie anymore. When that happens, you stop asking if it's right. You just breathe and step forward. He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. After he went to bed, I stayed awake for a long time, the lamp casting a soft halo on the papers spread before me. I reread the letter from the county, confirming the reinstatement of ownership. My name, Martha Harlow, printed clearly, unborrowed, unaltered. Beneath it, the simple phrase, "Property returned to rightful holder." I traced the words with my finger, feeling their weight. Not victory, exactly. More like restoration, the quiet repair of something that had been splintered but not destroyed. I thought about my son again, wherever he was driving that night, carrying the wreckage of his own choices. I hoped he would learn something from it, though I doubted he would. But I no longer needed his understanding. The bond between us was not broken. It had simply changed shape. Perhaps that is what forgiveness looks like in the real world. Not forgetting, not excusing, but allowing the story to continue without your permission. The rain stopped near midnight, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt sacred. I walked to the mirror in the hallway, the same one that had reflected my fear months ago, and looked at myself. My face was lined, my eyes tired, but there was something fierce beneath the weariness. I saw in that reflection the generations of women who had endured their own forms of theft, of names, of homes, of peace, and I felt their presence like a pulse behind my ribs. I whispered, "We're still here," and for once it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like truth. Before going to bed, I placed the county documents in the drawer of my nightstand, under the photo of Derek. In the picture, he's laughing, head tilted back, eyes crinkled. I touched his face lightly and said, "It's done." The words filled the room, steady and final. When I turned off the light, the darkness didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt earned, like rest after long labor. The house was silent, but not empty. It was listening, and for the first time, it was listening to me. The weeks after their departure unfolded like a slow exhale, each day longer and softer than the one before, as though the house itself were learning to breathe again after years of holding its breath. The mornings began quietly, the kind of quiet that has texture, layered with bird song, the creak of old pipes, the faint scratch of a tree branch against the window. I would wake before dawn, make coffee, and sit by the kitchen window, watching the light gather in cautious increments across the garden. The first weeks felt unreal, not because I missed them exactly, but because I was not accustomed to a life without tension humming underneath the walls. I kept expecting an interruption, a footstep, the sound of keys in the door, some sign that the old balance of fear and routine would return, but it never did. The stillness stayed, patient and forgiving, like an animal that has decided to trust you again. At first, I moved through the house as though it belonged to someone else, pausing at thresholds, asking permission from ghosts that no longer had authority here. Slowly, though, I began to reclaim it, not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts. I painted the front door, a soft green, the same color as the kitchen cabinets my mother once had, and the brushstrokes steadied my hands more than any prayer ever could. I cleared the clutter from the living room, opened every curtain, let the light fall on corners that had grown accustomed to shadow. The basement, once the center of everything hidden, became a workshop of sorts. Ethan helped me string better lighting, and together we organized the boxes, one for letters, one for photographs, one for small tools that had belonged to Derek. Every label I wrote felt like a benediction, a way of naming the things I had survived and finally putting them in order. Ethan came over often. At first, I thought it was out of pity or guilt, but I soon realized it was something gentler than either. He simply liked the quiet, the way the house had changed. He said it felt honest, and I understood what he meant. Sometimes he did his homework at the kitchen table while I cooked. Sometimes we sat on the porch, saying nothing, watching the light fade across the street. There were questions he didn't ask, and I didn't force him to. Children, even older ones, sense when an answer is still cooling from the heat of its making. But one afternoon, as we were tending the tomato plants that had begun to climb the fence, he said softly, "Do you ever think they'll come back?" I looked at the small green fruit clustered on the vines, each one still waiting for the sun to finish what it had started. "Maybe," I said, "people always come back in some way, though not always through the door." He nodded, not pressing further, and we went on watering the plants, letting the simple rhythm of care speak for us both. Letters began to arrive after a few months. The first was from a lawyer confirming the final settlement. The house was entirely mine, debts cleared, all accounts closed. The second came weeks later, a plain envelope with no return address, but my son's handwriting unmistakable on its face. Inside, just a few lines. I'm sorry. I'm working. We're safe. Take care of Ethan. There was no apology elaborate enough to erase the past, and yet those few words felt strangely sufficient. They were not absolution, but acknowledgement, and that was all I needed. I put the letter in the bottom drawer with the others: marriage certificates, birth announcements, the map of a family drawn in ink that never quite dries. The seasons turned quietly. By autumn, the garden had taken on that burnished look of late life, everything ripening toward its end. I found myself content with solitude in a way I hadn't been in years. I no longer counted my usefulness in meals cooked or errands run. My worth was measured in quieter currencies: the steadiness of my breath, the clarity of my thoughts, the way I could now look at the walls and see not confinement, but shelter. Sometimes late at night I would hear the distant echo of the past, an imagined door closing, a voice raised in defense. But even those memories had lost their sharpness. They drifted through like fading music from another room, familiar but no longer commanding. I began keeping a small journal again, something I hadn't done since before Derek died. Each entry was a conversation with myself, a way to remind my mind that it was still expansive, still capable of story. I wrote about the light, the weather, the taste of coffee when it was fresh and unhurried. I wrote about Ethan's laughter, about how it had changed from a nervous staccato to something rounder, freer. I wrote about the basement, now filled with scent of cedar and paper, no longer a place of dread, but of memory. And sometimes I wrote about forgiveness, not as a gift to others, but as an act of hygiene, a necessary cleansing of bitterness, so that nothing festers in the corners of the heart. It was during one of these evenings, when the sun was setting low and the house smelled faintly of tomato leaves and old wood, that I understood the quiet miracle of survival. People think survival is loud, full of proclamations and victories. It isn't. It's the gentle insistence of breath, the quiet decision to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to keep watering plants, to keep showing up for the morning light. It's the art of choosing tenderness, even when the world has taught you to expect nothing but loss. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, church friends, strangers in grocery store aisles, each carrying her own invisible story of endurance. I wished I could tell them that there is a strange, uncelebrated power in simply staying, in outlasting the cruelty that once seemed impossible to bear. One evening, Ethan asked if I ever felt lonely. The question was innocent, but it lingered. I looked around the room at the soft lamplight falling on the walls, at the framed photographs of people I had loved and lost, and said, "Lonely isn't the same as alone. Loneliness is when you forget you belong to yourself. I don't forget anymore." He smiled in that quiet, thoughtful way of his, and I saw a trace of the boy he had been, the boy who whispered, "Check the basement," and changed everything. Sometimes, when the air is still and the house hums with the small noises of its own contentment, I walk down to the basement and stand there just to listen. It's bright now, organized, clean, but if you stand very still, you can hear the faint echo of the day it all began, the whispered warning, the turning of the key, the first discovery of truth beneath the dust. I don't try to silence that memory. I let it live here, part of the foundation. Every house needs something to hold it upright, and sometimes that thing is the very story that almost broke it. I'm 81, and I'm still here. I make my own coffee, pay my own bills, plant seeds in spring, and pull weeds in summer. My body aches in places it didn't before, but it also sings with a quiet kind of pride. I have learned that peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of honesty. If I could speak to another woman standing at the edge of her own invisible war, I would tell her this: believe the tremor in your gut, the whisper that sounds too small to matter. It's not madness, it's your wisdom trying to save your life. Tonight, before bed, I will open the basement door one last time and switch off the light. I'll listen to the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the house settling into its sleep, and I'll think about how easily a life can tilt toward darkness when silence is mistaken for love. Then I'll smile, because I have learned to love the silence on my own terms. It no longer hides anything from me. It keeps me company. It tells me that everything that needed to be said has already been spoken, and everything that needed to be saved has been saved.